Welcome back. Will Worsham joins us now for this week's Speaking Legal discussion. Thanks for coming in, Will. Good to see you.
Glad to be here.
All right, so here's the question. We're ready?
Okay.
What should I do to protect my assets if I or my husband end up needing long-term care?
Okay, sure. No, it's a great
say?
question. And you know, the question there is it just her assets, or is it their assets together? Because just my assets or their assets together. Well, we'll take this as if they're a married couple, and generally we're going to consider that as joint assets anyway. Well, the first thing, this just begs a question for an estate plan. I mean, that's the everything starts with an estate plan and all the pieces of that. The trust or the non-probate transfer stuff that you can do, the payable on death, transfer on death, beneficiary deeds, all that stuff. First of all, you want to get it in place. Generally, when people are talking about this, obviously the cost of a nursing home is really, really expensive. And if you don't have the assets to pay for it, that's where Medicaid steps in. And so a lot of people get into that scenario. But before Medicaid will pay, you have to exhaust all of your assets unless they're exempt assets, and there are certain things, portions of things that are exempt. You don't have to sell your house to do that. Your house is an exempt asset, and a car can be an exempt asset. But where some people want to go beyond planning is to say, well, Medicaid stepped in and paid for all that, but once you pass, then Medicaid has a lien on your estate and all your assets, and so they then have a right to come in and take the house, sell the house to pay off that Medicaid lien. So that's a scenario that a lot of people want to get into. There's really two places we're talking about planning. One is to make sure that you qualify for Medicaid to pay those expenses if that's what your goal is, and the other is then to protect your assets from Medicaid lien if it goes on farther than that. Now, you got to be careful about that. You don't want to get into a fraudulent situation,
Of course,
and we're not going to do that at all. But it all starts with a good estate plan. And one of the things you cannot do is transfer assets in order to qualify for Medicaid. They have the right to come back and say, well, you can't just give your house away. You can't just give away that $50,000 CD you had in order to qualify for Medicaid. You can't do that. So you have to plan for those things ahead of time.
Right.
What about, is there a certain amount of money you can transfer to somebody per year?
You hear the spend down.
Right.
Correct?
Well, that's a completely different question.
is.
That's that's a tax concern about how much you can give away without being subject to gift tax.
Right.
And that is obviously part of an estate plan to make sure you're giving away appropriate amounts of money if that's what you choose to do. But what we really want to do in a scenario like this, for most folks, are going to want to create a trust. The benefit to that is a trust is not necessarily used, so if that trust then transfers assets, then that may not be subject to a look-back period where you're dealing with a scenario like that.
Okay.
So having a trust in place is really what's important to protect your assets. Now, you can be the grantor, which is the person that puts the assets in the trust. You can be the trustee, which is the person that manages the trust, and you can be the beneficiary of your own trust. So there are three people that are affected by a trust, and you can be all three people. You can create it, you can fund it, manage it, and then you can be the beneficiary of it. But you can also set it up to where your kids can be the beneficiary of it. You can have successor trustees, so when you pass or become incompetent, they're taking care of your trust and they're managing your assets. And all these are asset protection tools that we use in the estate planning process.
Right. There's so many questions that can come off of this depending on how many kids you have and the whole thing.
It does. It gets very, very detailed, and I'd always feel like I'm remiss if, whenever we're talking about estate planning, to not talk about durable powers of attorneys. We've talked about those in the past. There's powers of attorney and durable power of attorney, and those don't deal specifically with what happens after you die, but they take care of that scenario where you're no longer able to manage those assets yourself. Very, very difficult scenario where you get into where there are things that need to take place, your assets need to be transferred because you're getting ready to go into long-term care, but you're not capable of doing that because you're mentally incompetent to do that at that point, but you have never given anybody else the authority to do it on your behalf, and you just get stuck in that scenario. So that's why we want to create durable power of attorney documents so that somebody else has the authority to take care of those financial decisions at a time when it needs to be done.
Okay, and I think you would agree, be very careful who you give that power of attorney over to, and give it some thought before you get to where you're on your last leg, and you sign it over to the only person that is around.
Well, you don't have to, absolutely, and you don't have to wait because of that, because you can create immediate durable power of attorneys that are immediate, but you can also create springing power of attorneys that don't take effect until a doctor's opinion is given that you're incapable of handling your own affairs.
And that is why we need you, Will, because we are not lawyers. There's so much to know about
Good legal advice and some really good
Exactly.
financial advice, and maybe even tax advice. How do you put all of this, figure out what you want to happen.
That's right.
And then I guess work backward. Anyway, if you have a legal question for Will, you can email him at wworsham@color10.com. He'll answer your question on the show. Thank you so
Thank
much,
you,
and
Will.
Happy
Good to
New
see
Year.
you. Happy New Year. Awesome.
See you next year.
I'll see you next
We'll
year.
see you
That's
next
right.
year. All right.
Up next, the Ramada Oasis is throwing a huge New Year's Eve party, and you don't want to miss it. We'll get to the details. Don't go away.